Sure. So my name is Mona Jeffries. I'm an epidemiologist and I work at Te Rangawaka, Victoria University, Wellington. I'm not an infectious disease epidemiologist, so when the COVID pandemic began, I took a fairly low profile. I didn't want to be in the media because infectious diseases aren't really my thing. But once people started talking about long COVID, that was when I got really interested. So that probably was around May, June 2020. We were watching what was happening overseas, what was happening in Europe and in America at that time. And I started becoming really interested. And I think it's been ever since then I've really followed what's happening all around the world in terms of long COVID and have been trying to also get some evidence about what's happening here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Yeah, no, really interested to talk about long COVID. And I guess one of the main reasons is that I've got ME, chronic fatigue syndrome. So I first got diagnosed with that in 2014 and was really sick for about 4 years. And over the last few years have managed to come to a level where I'm able to work, which is really lovely. Obviously still have to be really careful with how I live my life. But the parallels between long COVID and ME are so close, it's impossible not to have a really significant interest in what's happening with the long COVID research, which has just taken off over the last few years and become huge. Yes, so back in August 2021, then myself and Dr. Lynn Russell and a rather large team of other researchers were awarded funding from Aotearoa, the Ministry of Health, to conduct a study of everybody in Aotearoa who had had COVID. So it wasn't particularly looking at long COVID, but we did have a specific interest in long COVID. When they asked us to begin the research, that was back in that August 21, there was 2,500 people in the entire country who had had COVID-19. So we were fairly confident we could get a big chunk of those people to take part in our research. We launched the study on the 17th of August 2021, which was also the day that we went into the Delta lockdown. So of course that changed everything. The entire landscape changed. However, it was a really interesting time to be doing research, and we ended up with about 1,000 people in our study. And those were all people who had COVID-19 prior to the Omicron outbreak. So we included people who had COVID-19 before Delta and those who had Delta, the Delta variant, but not those who had the Omicron outbreak. And that cutoff was really just because of the timescale of the study. So the study ran for 12 months, so it finished in August 22, and we've now been doing the analysis and are writing up some of the results and are ready to present some of those. So in terms of the symptoms of long COVID, what we found here in Aotearoa exactly mirrors what's happening overseas. So the most common symptoms are extreme fatigue, brain fog, aches, muscle aches, headaches, joint aches. And then some people have rather specific symptoms that are related to lung damage that might have happened during the COVID infection, and other people have less common symptoms as well. So probably after the ones I've mentioned, the next most common symptom would be POTS, so a measure of orthostatic intolerance, so things like dizziness when you stand up, which isn't just as simple as it going away after a few seconds, but is really quite debilitating. In terms of severity of symptoms, we didn't specifically ask that, but what we did, as well as doing surveys with people with long COVID, we did very in-depth interviews. And so we were able to understand the symptoms which had the greatest impact on people with long COVID. And I think probably the ones that had the greatest impact were the fatigue and the brain fog. And when I'm talking about impacts, I'm really talking about ability to live the life that people were living before they got sick. So that might be in terms of whānau responsibilities, it might be in terms of work, it might be in terms of social life. So those impacts were huge and have been really badly affected by some of the symptoms which are quite debilitating. We were particularly interested in looking at the impact of COVID-19 on people who are disabled, so who had a disability prior to getting COVID. We didn't have a very large number of people in our samples, so the results are not not as robust as they could be, but what it did show is that in virtually every measure, the impacts for disabled people were greater than those who are not disabled. And when I talk about impacts, that's both impacts on work, impacts on having a good relationship with the health service. So we've had lots of stories of people who have had not been believed by their doctors in terms of long COVID, and those were exacerbated by people who had a pre-existing disability. Having said that, we still do have some additional analysis to do in that front, and we've appointed somebody who's going to start in early 2023, specifically looking at the data on disabled people, so that we'll be able to look at that in a lot more detail. Our study was set up with a very strong Te Tiriti-based framework, so it was co-led by myself and Dr. Lynn Russell, and in every aspect of the study then there was equal participation in terms of the resourcing, the staffing and the participants in terms of tangata whenua and tangata tiriti. So it was really important to us to have a very clear Māori voice coming through. And really interestingly, in terms of long COVID, there was virtually no difference for tangata whenua compared to tangata tiriti. And that is quite different compared to almost any other condition that we look at in Aotearoa, where very often then the poorer outcomes are experienced by Māori. For long COVID, then the poorer outcomes appeared to be experienced across the board. There was no difference in terms of how frequently Māori reported long COVID compared to non-Māori. And as I say, very little difference in terms of the nature of the impacts, which really are across the board. They're in people's social life, in people's work and economic life, in whānau life, and in every aspect of people's lifestyles. In terms of Pacific people, it was a little bit different. We had a very strong Pacific research team who also did a number of interviews with Pacific people with long COVID. But the quantitative, so the numerical data that we had from our survey showed that Pacific people were less likely to report ongoing symptoms of COVID-19. So we didn't specifically use the term long COVID, we asked people about their ongoing symptoms. And it seemed like Pacific people were less likely to report ongoing symptoms in the survey data. And when we look at the qualitative data, that's those in-depth interviews, Pacific people were finding alternative reasons for their ongoing symptoms. Some of them talked about, this is me just getting older, well, I've got underlying symptoms, so it's probably just that, getting worse. I personally, and the Pacific research team agree that there's no reason to think that the likelihood of getting long COVID is going to differ by ethnicity. So it probably is about recognition and attribution of the symptoms, both by individuals and by their health providers, rather than an innate difference for Pacific people. So we heard a whole range of stories of people's experiences of the health service in terms of their long COVID support, management and treatment. So obviously there is no magic pill for long COVID, if only there was. But we do know that many people with long COVID would benefit hugely from having their symptoms well treated and supported by health professionals. Very few people in our sample had received a referral to secondary care. So people could have benefited, for example, for referrals to cardiologists, to neurologists, to physios, but that just wasn't happening. Even when people did have a referral made on their behalf, so from their primary care provider, we had lots of stories of people whose referrals were not accepted into the secondary care system. Many people said that their GPs supported them and were very understanding, but we also heard lots of stories of people whose GPs were not believing, who said it was all in their head, who just felt that they had been essentially gaslit, that their GPs weren't believing the range of symptoms that they were presenting with. One of the great stories that did come out was the benefits of Māori providers and of Pacific providers, who throughout the pandemic have really stood up to be the key providers of support, mainly for Māori and for Pacific communities, but actually are providing support for a lot of people living in their areas. So I think we still have got a lot to do in terms of making sure that GPs, who are always going to be the first port of call, really have a great understanding of what long COVID is, what can help, because we do know there are things that can help. We also know there are things that can hurt, and we know that a lot of GPs are still stuck in the era, I guess, of ME treatment, of trying to push through symptoms, push through fatigue, and get people out exercising. And we know that for a lot of people with long COVID, that is not what they need necessarily. So it's really important that GPs are well educated in the optimal management of long COVID. And of course, that's changing all the time. So it's really easy to say this is the ideal, this is what we want everyone to be really right up there with the research, but it's very difficult when the research is changing. So one of our next steps in our research is to be able to regularly synthesize what's happening around the world so that we have an optimal resource that people can go to. And when I say people, I mean individuals with long COVID, their support, whānau, as well as health professionals. Because if we're able to do that as researchers and synthesize that evidence and make it available and accessible, I think that's something that we can that can be really useful. So we do know that long COVID has really significant effects on people's ability to have any level of activity, or at least the level of activity they were previously used to. So we had lots of stories of people who previously used to be very high exercisers, might be really involved in cooking for the rugby club or in participating in various different sports. And most of those people have had stories of just having to stop. And that really provided a challenge in terms of changed identity. Who am I now? I used to do this, but now I can't. In terms of mental activity, then very few people at the time we interviewed them realised how that was triggering their symptoms. But we do know from ME research that any level of activity, whether it be physical, whether it be mental, whether it be emotional activity or stress, can knock people back, can really be a challenge in terms of being able to get through the day often. So I think it's very important that people know that mental activity is a real activity. That might be that reading a book is too much of a challenge. It might be that doing a crossword is too much of a challenge. And I think it's important that when you're learning to live with long COVID, as people have learned to live with ME, that you realise what you're able to manage and what you're not able to manage. From the survey data, then virtually everybody said that either mental or physical activity exacerbated their symptoms, which again is very similar to ME, real parallels there. And from memory, it was something like 3/4 of people said that mental or physical activity made their symptoms markedly or significantly worse. So it's not just, I'll read a book now and I might feel a bit tired for half an hour. It really is, that might actually mean I can do nothing for the rest of the day or nothing tomorrow. So I think it's really important that people do learn to pace themselves and to realise that the different levels of activity are going to be different for each person. So for what one person might be able to walk to the end of the driveway, someone else might be able to walk to the shop, someone else might only be able to walk to the bathroom. And those different levels of activities are going to be different for each person, but are very consistently seen across everybody with long COVID. I think it's fair to say that the effect of long COVID on people's ability to live their usual lives in terms of their social impact and in terms of their emotional impact was really huge. So many people talked about having to learn to live a new life, learn to cope with this new identity. And as a result of that, the levels of mental distress that we saw were really high. So about 1 in 3 people at the time we either interviewed or surveyed them were living with long COVID and reported significant levels of mental distress. So when I say distress, I mean either anxiety or depression or both. And this wasn't people just reporting how they felt. We use very standardised questions which are used across the world to identify clinical levels of mental distress. What was really worrying was that most people, although they identified the need for mental health support, weren't accessing it or hadn't been offered it by their primary care provider. So there was a huge gap between those people who reported levels of mental distress and the levels of mental health support they were getting. And that was another area where, for disabled people, the gap was even bigger. So disabled people having a much higher level of mental distress and a lower level of receiving support. So that really is a gap that needs to be filled urgently. So we didn't directly collect information about that gap between experiencing mental distress and having a need for mental health support. But what we did do was ask people about what they felt would help. And one of the very top reasons so among people with long COVID, sort of things that would help were provision of wraparound support by a GP or a primary care provider. So not just the physical health, but also the emotional health, also some direction about where to get financial support, how to apply for WINS support. So many people were finding themselves in situations that they had never had to do this before, or were not coping, for example, financially with how they were, given that they were now unable to work at the same level they were working previously. So what we ideally are looking for in a change of service would be where there is a health navigator or somebody who can help people with long COVID who are really struggling, might well be struggling physically and mentally to navigate their way around really complex services, health services and social services, financial services, the benefits system, to try to get the most beneficial outcomes for people. So we do know that in other service areas, like for example in cancer services, then health navigators are used really successfully. And I think that long COVID is going to be another area where having a health navigator, where you have one single point of contact who can help you navigate your way around these different systems, is going to be really key. The aim of our study was to provide recommendations to the Ministry of Health to be able to better support people with COVID-19. So that's including, but not exclusively, long COVID. Obviously, things have changed quite markedly over the time of the pandemic. And at the time we were collecting information, that we weren't only collecting information that's relevant now. So we've got a lot of data about, for example, isolating in MIQ. Having said that, we have made a whole series of recommendations around long COVID that I think are still really pertinent now. And those are going to be presented to the Ministry of Health early in 2023 and will be made available at that time. I think a lot of those recommendations are going to parallel the calls that are frequently made by the ME community. So revolve around being listened to, being understood, being able to access care when and where you need it, because there are so many parallels with the two different conditions that I think we'll be able to learn from each other. And that's certainly an area of research that we're hoping to take forward as well in terms of comparing ME with long COVID. I think probably one of the most exciting things that's happened recently is the announcement of the government inquiry into the COVID-19 response. And I think it's really important that the long COVID voice is heard in that inquiry. At the time we're recording this, then how that's going to happen isn't necessarily clear. We are going to make a very clear submission based on the information that we've collected from our study, because we believe that we have huge amounts of insight into the impacts of COVID-19 and long COVID on people's lives from the stories that people have very generously shared with us. So I guess to anybody with long COVID, if you are approached to make a submission to the inquiry, then really happy for people to get in touch with us and try to coordinate a response on behalf of the long COVID community. In terms of advice for people with long COVID, then there's a lot of information out there. Things are changing really quickly, and there's a lot of us who are working really hard to make things better. Take as much advice as you can from the research that's done for the ME community. Not enough has been done over many decades, but that is changing as well. And I think don't give up hope. We don't yet know the trajectory of long COVID, but there are definitely people who have ME, like myself, who have managed to get from being bedridden to a stage of being able to work. And not everybody is as lucky as I am, but some people are. And I do think that there's hope for people with long COVID, that the trajectory won't necessarily be as difficult as it is for some people with ME. And the reason I say that is because we do know what can work well for ME, and that is pacing. And if right from the very beginning you listen to your body and you allow yourself to slow down within all the constraints that I understand of being needing to provide for yourself and your family, having to work, having to earn an income, if you can take it as easy as you can, if you can pace your life, we do know you're much less likely to be tipped over into what we in the ME community will call severe illness. And we do know that it's much easier to recover from, for example, a moderate state to get back to a mild state rather than those people who have become bedridden. So don't give up hope. Do keep an eye on the research. Where it's helpful for you, then there are plenty of online support groups. There's ME Auckland, there's a Facebook group which is specifically for people with long COVID, and there's a lot of international groups as well. We also know that not everybody has benefited from those. We've heard stories where people, in our research, where people have felt that it's not for them, and that's okay. It's all right to say, actually, engaging with these other people at different stages of their illness isn't necessarily what I need right now. But there's plenty of information out there. The research is ongoing, and would just like to thank everybody who has contributed to our research and to a number of other long COVID research projects that are ongoing. We're all trying to work together across different institutions across the country to make sure that we work for the benefit of people with long COVID.